After a devastating accident that left him confined to a wheelchair and completely blind, a millionaire businessman lived isolated in his own mansion while his wife quietly took full control of his million-dollar empire. When a new cleaner was hired, she brought along something unexpected, her 6-year-old daughter, who began playing innocently near him every day. The girl, with her natural curiosity and pure affection, noticed something very strange in his eyes. And what happens next is unbelievable. The scent of polished wood and lemon permeated the air in the office, a clean, sterile fragrance that couldn't quite mask the silent opulence of the mansion. Arthur felt the morning sun on his face, a warmth he couldn't see, but one that reminded him of a vibrant world that existed only in his memories. Seated in his leather wheelchair, he was the motionless king of an empire he could no longer rule. The accident had taken the movement from his legs and, according to the doctors and his wife, the light from his eyes. Since waking from the coma, his universe had been reduced to darkness, muffled sounds, and the velvety, controlling voice of Veronica. Every morning, the ritual was the same. She would enter, the rustle of her silk dress announcing her presence even before her expensive perfume reached him. "Good morning, my love," she'd say, her voice a balm that hid a subtle poison. "Time for your eye drops. To keep your eyes hydrated and protected." He'd hear the click of the small glass vial, a sound that had become the metronome of his confined life. He would tilt his head back, a gesture of submission that eroded his soul a little more each day. The drops would fall, cold, followed by a light, fleeting sting that Veronica always dismissed as a sign they're working. Arthur said nothing. He had learned that silence was his only armor. Questioning only brought condescending answers and reminders of his total dependence. That day, however, something was different. The sting seemed to last a second longer, a needle prick of discomfort that his intuition seized upon. He felt, in the depths of his being, that something was wrong. It was a feeling that grew like a weed, choking the trust he had once placed in his wife. Veronica, oblivious to his internal turmoil, began leafing through a stack of papers on his desk. "Darling, I had to make an important decision about that tech stock portfolio," she said, her pen scratching against the paper with an authority that was once his. "With the market's instability, I thought it prudent to liquidate a portion of the investment, protecting our assets, of course." The word "our" sounded hollow. The assets were his, built with decades of work, sleepless nights, and a business acumen few possessed. Now, his vast fortune was in her hands, and he couldn't even see the documents she signed in his name. "You did what you thought was best, Veronica," he replied, his voice neutral, trained not to reveal the storm brewing inside him. His mind, the only part of him that was still truly free, raced, trying to connect the invisible dots. The hasty sale of assets, the phone calls she abruptly ended when he was near, the growing isolation from the outside world. They were pieces of a puzzle being assembled in the dark. He was a multi-millionaire imprisoned by his own wealth, a fortress that had become his cell. As Veronica continued to talk about dividends and cash flow, a new sound, strange and completely unexpected, shattered the suffocating routine. First, a soft, hesitant knock on the imposing mahogany office door. Then, Veronica's voice, sharp and annoyed. "What is it now?" And then, before another word could be spoken, a sound as clear as a crystal bell echoed through the silent hallway, slipped through the door, and filled the office with a life that had long been absent. It was the sound of a child's laugh, pure and contagious. Arthur stiffened in his chair, his heart pounding. Who was here? Who would dare bring a child into his sanctuary of controlled silence and darkness? For an instant, the scent of lemon was replaced by a breeze of hope, so subtle and yet so powerful it left him breathless. The laugh was like a stone thrown onto the still surface of a lake. Veronica reacted first, her body tensing so sharply Arthur could hear the taut rustle of her dress. "What is the meaning of this?" she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. The sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor of the hallway was sharp and impatient. The office door opened with a dry click, and a new set of sounds invaded Arthur's sanctuary, the hurried, breathless apology of a woman and the tiny sound of little feet shuffling on the rug. "Mrs. Thorne, I am so sorry," the woman's voice said, trembling with fear. She slipped away for just a second. "It won't happen again." Arthur pictured the scene, a hunched-over woman, probably young, and a small child hiding behind her legs. "This is a house of order. Elena, not a playground." Veronica's voice cut through the air, cold as ice. "I was very clear during the interview. No distractions." "I know, Mom. It's just my neighbor who watches her had a family emergency, and I had no one else. I couldn't lose this job." The desperate honesty in the woman's voice, Elena, touched something dormant in Arthur. It was the voice of someone struggling in the real world, a world he had forgotten. Immersed in his own insulated fortune, he, who managed a net worth of billions, suddenly felt poor in the face of that simple, raw fight for survival. The ensuing silence was heavy, charged with Veronica's power to crush the woman's hope with a single word. Arthur felt the need to intervene. It was an impulse he hadn't felt in months, a spark of his former authority. "Let her stay, Veronica." The words came out firmer than he'd expected. The silence shifted, now tinged with shock. He felt his wife's gaze on him, a look he knew would be a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Arthur, darling, you need your peace. A child here will only disturb you." "Silence can be deafening sometimes," he replied, with a calmness that surprised her. "A little life won't hurt." There was a pause, and he knew he had won this small battle. Veronica couldn't contradict him in front of an employee without seeming like the monster he was beginning to suspect she was. "Very well," she conceded, her voice forcedly sweet. "But the girl is to stay quiet in a corner. If I hear one peep, Elena, you'll be on the street." The threat hung in the air, and Arthur heard a hurried whisper from Elena to her daughter, Lily. From that moment on, the office routine changed. Arthur would hear the discreet sounds of Elena's cleaning in the background, the soft cloth gliding over wood, the low hum of a vacuum in distant rooms. But it was the absence of sound that most caught his attention. He knew the little girl was there, somewhere, a small ghost containing her vibrant energy. He found himself wondering what she looked like. Did she have her mother's hair, the curious eyes that all children possess? While Veronica was busy on another call about selling some of his assets, a call she made sure to take in the garden, away from his ears, the silence in the office became almost absolute. But it wasn't empty. It was an expectant silence. And then he felt it. Not a sound, but a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a slight disturbance in the air near his chair. It was the presence of someone very small and very close. He held his breath, his heart thumping against his ribs. He heard an almost imperceptible rustle of fabric, and then the warmth, a tiny, hesitant and incredibly alive warmth, landed on his hand, which rested inert on the cold metal armrest of his chair. The touch was as light as a feather, a child's hand, and it sent an electric shock through his entire body. The touch of the small hand on his skin was like lightning on a starless night. Arthur remained completely still, afraid that the slightest movement might break the spell and make the connection vanish. It had been years since he had felt a touch so devoid of intent, a contact that asked for nothing, measured nothing, simply was. Veronica's hand was always cool, her fingers long and calculating, even in her supposed gestures of affection. But this little hand was warm, soft, and pulsed with innocent life. Suddenly, the warmth was gone. A hurried sound of bare feet on the carpet was followed by a terrified whisper from Elena. "Lily, no! Oh my God! I'm so sorry, Mr. Thorne. She's just so curious. The woman's voice broke into a stifled sob. Arthur raised his hand, a gesture that cost him considerable effort, but one he had to make. "It's all right, Eleanor," he said, his voice a little hoarse with emotion. "No harm done." He turned in the direction where he felt the girl's presence. "What's your name, little one?" A deep silence settled in the room. He could sense the child's hesitation and her mother's fear. Finally, a tiny, timid voice, almost inaudible, answered, "Lily, Lily," he repeated, savoring the name. "Like the flower. That's a beautiful name." In the days that followed, a new dynamic established itself in the office. While Elena worked quietly, Lily, after receiving Arthur's unspoken permission, would find a small corner on the Persian rug near his wheelchair. She brought with her a worn rag doll and some colored wooden blocks. Her sounds were discreet, the hum of a made-up song, the soft click of blocks fitting together, the whisper with which she told secrets to her doll. To Arthur, those sounds were a symphony. They filled a void that not even the most expensive classical music could reach. He thought of his immense wealth, of all the financial instruments, the investment funds that generated compound interest, but he realized all that money couldn't buy the genuine peace that the child's presence brought him. Veronica, thankfully, spent most of her time in meetings or in her own office, managing the family business. She seemed content that the girl was quiet and didn't disturb her invalid husband. Little did she know that Lily was, in fact, awakening him. One afternoon, as Arthur listened to an audiobook on the history of the stock market, a pathetic attempt to stay connected to his old world, he once again felt that subtle shift in the air. Lily had stopped playing. He heard the rustle of her little dress and felt her presence right beside his chair. She didn't touch him this time. She just stood there, watching him. He could feel the weight of her gaze on his face. What did a child see when she looked at him? A broken man? A sleeping giant? Curiosity consumed him. He desperately wanted to see through her eyes. He turned off the audiobook with a click of the remote. The silence returned, but now it was charged with a childlike intensity. He felt Lily's warm, sweet breath near his face. She must have been on her tiptoes, leaning in to get a better look. Her innocence made her fearless. She didn't see a powerful billionaire or a sick man. She just saw a man with something curious about his eyes. And then her voice rang out, clear and bright in the silent office, carrying an observation so simple and so devastating that it made Arthur's world stop spinning. "Mister," she said, with the purest, most genuine curiosity, "why do you have gunk in your eye? Doesn't anyone clean it for you?" Lily's question hung in the air, laden with a weight the simple words couldn't contain. Gunk! The word echoed in Arthur's mind, shaking the foundations of his dark reality. For an instant, the world stopped. The distant hum of traffic, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, everything vanished. Only the soft breath of the girl beside him and the frantic hammering of his own heart existed. He, a man who built an empire by analyzing complex data and market trends, who dealt in dollars and yen as easily as he breathed, was completely disarmed by a child's observation. Gunk. Not an injury, not damage. It was something that, in a child's logic, could simply be cleaned. The spell was broken by Elena's sharp, horrified gasp. "Lily! Oh my goodness, I am so sorry, Mr. Thorne." The rustle of fabric was swift, and Arthur felt the small presence being pulled away from him. "What have I told you about bothering people? Apologize right now." "But Mommy, Lily's little voice began, full of confusion. "Now, Lily, to your corner." Elena's command was a whisper of pure panic. She was undoubtedly imagining her dismissal, the end of her only source of income, but Arthur couldn't let it go. This was the first sliver of light in months of absolute darkness. "Wait," he said, his voice coming out stronger than he intended. Elena stopped instantly. "Sir, let her stay with me." He turned his head toward Lily. "Don't worry, Elena. She isn't bothering me. Quite the opposite." He held out his hand into the void, hoping to find the girl. "Lily, come here. Tell me about this gunk. Where do you see it?" He heard Elena's hesitation, a shaky breath, but then the soft sound of Lily's little feet approached again. She stopped right in front of him, so close he could feel the warmth of her body. "It's right there," she said, her voice more confident now. "In both eyes. It covers the black dot and the colored part. It looks like a really thin piece of gelatin that dried. When the light hits it, it shines a little. A thin piece of gelatin. That dried." The words seared themselves into his mind. Suddenly, the memory of the morning ritual with Veronica assaulted him with terrifying clarity. The cold drops, the light sting that lasted only a few seconds. Veronica always said it was to protect his eyes. Protect them from what? From the light, from the world. The suspicion that had been growing inside him, once a formless whisper, now took on sharp, monstrous contours. This wasn't a treatment. It was a barrier, a translucent film applied daily to keep his world in darkness, to keep his vast net worth under someone else's control. Rage rose in his throat, hot as molten metal, but he swallowed it down. Rage was a luxury he couldn't afford, not now. Now he needed clarity, certainty. He needed to know if the most terrible fantasy his mind could conjure was, in fact, reality. He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that only Lily could hear, a secret shared between the imprisoned giant and his tiny, unlikely liberator. "Lily," he began, his heart pounding so hard he feared she could hear it. "Are you a very brave girl?" He felt more than heard her nod. "Yes." "Sir? Then I need to ask you to do the bravest thing of all. Do you think you could take that gunk out of my eye with your little finger?" Arthur's request, whispered and freighted with desperate urgency, made the air in the office thin. Elena let out a sharp gasp, a sound of pure terror. "Mr. Thorne, please, no. She's just a child. She could hurt you. Lily, come here this instant." The mother's voice was a mix of plea and command, but Lily didn't move. She stared at Arthur's face, her big brown eyes filled not with fear, but with a solemn concentration. She seemed to understand that this was more than a game. It was a mission. "She won't hurt me, Elena," Arthur said, keeping his voice low and calm so as not to frighten the girl. "I trust her. Please." He felt a small hand touch his cheek, a gesture to steady his head. The touch was light, almost reverent. He held his breath, his entire body tense with expectation. He heard Lily's concentrated breathing near his ear. "I'll be very careful, mister," she whispered, as if sharing the greatest of secrets. He felt her little fingers, surprisingly steady, touch his right eyelid. With a delicacy no trained adult could possess, she used her tiny fingernail to find the edge of the invisible film. He felt a strange traction, a painless pull, as if a second skin were being gently peeled from his eye. The process lasted an eternity contained in seconds, and then it happened. The film came loose. An avalanche of light hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was a white, blinding, painful light. He recoiled instinctively, a groan escaping his lips as his eyes, unaccustomed to any stimulus, contracted in agony. "Did I hurt you?" Lily's voice sounded, full of panic. "No, sweetie, no," he managed to say, forcing his eyes to open against the pain. At first, everything was a blur of indistinct shapes and colors, a chaotic, abstract painting. But slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, the shapes began to gain definition. The first thing he saw clearly was her, Lily's face, just inches from his. Big brown eyes, filled with concern. A small smudge of chocolate at the corner of her mouth. Straight, dark hair falling over her forehead. She was real. She was the light, and through her, the world returned to him. He saw the intricate gold of the Persian rug, the gleam of the polished mahogany of his desk, the leather-bound books on the shelves. He saw Eleanor, huddled near the door, her face pale with terror, her hands twisting her apron. The sight was a miracle, and in the next second the miracle morphed into a monstrous truth. The gunk, the gelatin, the eye drops. Veronica, her name exploded in his mind, not with love, but with the venom of a betrayal so profound it stole the air from his lungs. It wasn't a treatment, it was a prison, a chemical curtain applied day after day to keep him blind, helpless, docile. His entire fortune, his empire built on sweat and genius, was being plundered by his own wife while he sat here, a blind king on a throne of lies. A cold, calculating fury replaced the shock. He looked at Elena's terrified expression and Lily's innocence, and knew, with absolute certainty, what he had to do. Revealing the truth now would put these two in mortal danger. Veronica would crush them without a second thought. He needed time. He needed a plan. With an effort of will that surpassed anything he had ever done in his life, he let his eyelids fall slowly, plunging back into darkness, but this time it was a self-imposed darkness, a strategic one. He reached out his hand, the slow, hesitant gesture of a blind man, until he found Lily's shoulder. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that Eleanor would interpret as gratitude. But that was, in truth, the birth of a silent vengeance. "You're my hero." He heard Eleanor's sigh of relief, but in his mind, the gears were already turning. The game had changed. He was no longer the victim. He was the predator, hiding in plain sight, and his prey had no idea that the blind man could now see her every move. The self-imposed darkness was different. It was no longer a prison, but a trench. Arthur spent the rest of that day and the days that followed in a state of high alert, every fiber of his being tuned to the world he could now secretly see. He learned to control his reflexes, not to turn his head toward a sound, not to follow Veronica's movements across the room with his eyes. He became the most dedicated actor in his own tragedy. The morning ritual became both a torture and a necessity. When Veronica approached with the vial of eye drops, he fought the urge to snatch it from her hand. Instead, he tilted his head back, offering his eyes to her treachery. He felt the cold drop fall, and as soon as she left the room, he'd feign a need for the bathroom, rush to the sink, and flush his eyes with water to remove as much of the film as possible before it fully set. These were stolen, precious moments of clear vision that he used to study his environment as never before. He saw the way Veronica looked at the bank statements on her tablet, a gleam of avarice in her eyes he had never noticed. He saw the text messages she typed hurriedly, always angling the screen away from him. He saw the false smiles she gave him, smiles that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. She was a stranger living in his house, wearing his clothes, spending his money. The vulnerability he had felt for months transformed into a quiet strength. He was no longer a helpless patient, he was a spy in enemy territory. Lily and Elena became his unwitting allies. Their presence was the perfect cover. Veronica saw them as a harmless distraction for her invalid husband, a whim she tolerated, but to Arthur they were his lifeline. Lily, with her childlike perception, became his eyes and ears in a way no one could suspect. He taught her a silent game. "Lily, let's play I Spy," he would whisper when they were alone. "You sit very still and tell me everything you see out the window." And she would. "The gardener's truck is here. The lady in the blue dress is walking on the sidewalk. A red bird landed on the rose bush." They were trivial details that reconnected him to the world, but they also served as training for what was to come. One morning, the tension escalated. Veronica entered the office while Elena was dusting the shelves. Arthur was pretending to listen to an audiobook. "Elena," Veronica said, her voice a little too casual. "I notice my diamond brooch isn't in my jewelry box. You haven't happened to see it anywhere, have you?" Elena froze mid-motion, the dust cloth still in her hand. "No, Mrs. Thorne. I don't go into your bedroom. Only the common areas, as you instructed." Arthur kept his eyes closed, but his hearing was sharp. He could feel the fear radiating from Eleanor. "How strange," Veronica continued, pacing slowly around the office. "It's just vanished. It's a family heirloom, of great sentimental value, and financial, of course. It cost a small fortune." The accusation was unspoken, but it hung in the air, venomous and suffocating. It was a warning, a show of power. She was telling Elena that she was disposable, that she could be framed and destroyed at any moment. Veronica was starting to feel that Elena and Lily were getting too close to her husband, and this was her first move to drive them away. Arthur felt his blood boil. She wasn't just stealing his assets. She was willing to ruin an innocent woman's life to protect her secrets. In that moment, he realized passivity was no longer an option. Feigning blindness was only the first step. Now, he needed to act, to find a way to fight back from inside his own prison. Later, when Veronica left for one of her mysterious business lunches, he called Lily over. "Lily, remember our game," he whispered. "Now we're going to play a different one, a very important hide-and-seek game. Mommy Veronica has a phone. Sometimes she talks on it in the garden. I need you, without anyone seeing, to tell me what she says. Can you do that for me?" Lily looked at him, her eyes serious and full of understanding. She didn't grasp the details, the betrayal, the danger, but she understood the tone in his voice. She understood that the mister needed her help. She nodded solemnly. The little spy had accepted her first mission. The garden became the new stage for the mansion's silent drama. Lily, with the stealth that only children possess, found ways to be close enough to hear but far enough not to be seen. Hiding behind an azalea bush or pretending to tie her shoes near the glass patio door, she became Arthur's ears to the outside world. The first reports were fragmented. Stray phrases like "the wire transfer was confirmed" or "he doesn't suspect a thing." They were pieces of a puzzle Arthur painfully assembled in his mind, confirming his worst suspicions. The sale of his assets wasn't to protect the estate. It was a systematic looting of his wealth. Every phone call was another nail in the coffin of his trust. The tension in the house was palpable. Veronica, sensing the bond between Arthur and the housekeeper's family strengthening, began to tighten the screws. She would accidentally spill coffee on a floor Elena had just cleaned. She would find imaginary strands of hair on the furniture. They were small cruelties designed to destabilize and create a pretext for dismissal. Arthur watched it all from his chair, his face a mask of passivity while a helpless rage burned within him. He knew he needed concrete proof, something irrefutable he could use against her. The opportunity came on a rainy afternoon. The rain beat against the office windows, creating a curtain of sound that muffled the house's noises. Veronica, believing Arthur was dozing in his chair and that Elena and Lily were in the kitchen, took out her phone to make a call. She didn't go to the garden because of the weather. Instead, she stood near the office window, her back to him, watching the storm outside. Lily, who had been playing quietly on the rug, understood the cue. She crawled under Arthur's large mahogany desk, a perfect hiding spot. Arthur kept his breathing slow and even, his eyes closed beneath the milky film. He heard the familiar sound of dialing. Veronica's voice was low, but in the quiet of the office, every word was crystal clear. "Yes, it's me," she said. "Listen, things are moving slower than I'd hoped. He's too stable." There was a pause as she listened to the person on the other end. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. Too stable. What did that mean? "No, we can't risk another attempt," she continued, and the hesitation on the word attempt was like a punch to Arthur's gut. Last time was too close. We need to accelerate the process another way. The paperwork is almost all in place. With the power of attorney I have, I can finalize everything. I just need to make sure he remains incapacitated. Yes, that's still the plan. We just have to ensure everything is settled before anyone starts asking questions. The call ended abruptly. Veronica put her phone away and left the office without a backward glance. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain and Lily's frightened breathing from under the desk. Arthur remained motionless, his brain spinning, trying to process the monstrosity of what he had just heard. Accelerate the process. Another attempt. The truth hit him with the force of a runaway train. The accident that had stolen the movement from his legs, hadn't been an accident at all. It had been an attempt. And now she was planning something more. The eye drops weren't just to keep him blind and controllable. They were a temporary measure until she could finalize her master plan. Lily crawled out from under the desk, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't understand the meaning of the words, but she sensed the danger. She approached Arthur, and for the first time, he didn't care about pretending. He opened his eyes, the film making his vision blurry, but not enough to hide the truth. He looked at the little girl, and in her frightened face, he saw the reflection of his own terror. The game had just changed drastically. This was no longer about money, about stocks or dividends. This was about his life. Arthur's world had reconfigured in an instant. The revelation from Veronica's phone call wasn't just a piece of the puzzle, it was the picture on the box, revealing a tableau of betrayal and mortal danger he could barely comprehend. All his focus, previously aimed at uncovering financial fraud and the manipulation of his business, now narrowed to a single, primal instinct: survival. His vast fortune, the crypto investments, the gold held in Swiss vaults, all of it became irrelevant, mere props on a stage where his life was the main prize. He looked at Lily, who was still watching him with huge, frightened eyes, and felt a wave of protectiveness so fierce it startled him. She and her mother were no longer just innocent bystanders. They were unwitting accomplices, dragged into the center of a dangerous hurricane by their own kindness. "Lily," he whispered, his voice taut. "Our game, it just got very, very serious. More than ever, no one can know that I can see a little bit, especially not Mommy Veronica. Do you understand me?" The little girl nodded, her jaw set in a mimicry of adult determination. And you need to be very careful," he continued, the urgency making his words heavy. "Don't be alone with her, ever. If she offers you candy or juice or anything, you say no, thank you, and run to your mum. Promise." "I promise," she answered, her small voice firm. That silent pact, sealed in the dim office as the storm raged outside, transformed the dynamic between them. He was no longer just the kind Mr. He was someone who needed protecting, and she, his tiny guardian. Later, Veronica returned, her usual smile plastered on her face, but now Arthur saw right through it. He saw the coldness underneath, the calculating intent. She brought him a cup of tea. "To warm you up, my love. You looked like you were getting a chill." He accepted it, his heart hammering. Was it just tea? He thanked her and waited for her to turn away before placing the untouched cup on the side table. Every gesture from her was now a potential threat. The real test came late that afternoon. Veronica entered the office with the familiar glass vial in her hand. "Darling, I noticed your eyes are a little red. I think the pressure change from the rain has irritated them. The doctor said that on days like this, an extra dose of drops can help soothe them." Icy panic coursed through Arthur's veins. An extra dose. It meant that what little vision he managed to reclaim by washing his eyes in the morning would be completely obliterated. She was, intentionally or not, blinding him anew, cutting off his only advantage. He couldn't refuse. Refusal would raise suspicion. With a heavy heart, he tilted his head back, feeling like a prisoner walking to his own execution. The drops fell, colder and more stinging than ever. The film formed quickly, thick and opaque. The vibrant world of colors and shapes he had reclaimed dissolved into a gray fog, and then into total darkness. He was blind again, truly blind. Frustration and helplessness suffocated him. Veronica, satisfied, patted his shoulder. "There. Better now, isn't it?" Before leaving, she turned to Eleanor, who was finishing organizing some books. "Eleanor," she said, her voice suddenly hard, "starting tomorrow, I'd like your daughter to stay in the kitchen or the utility area with you. Mr. Thorne needs absolute tranquility in his office. The constant presence of a child can be overly stimulating for his condition." The blow was precise and cruel. She wasn't just blinding him physically, she was isolating him, taking away his eyes and ears. She was severing his only line of communication with the world. He heard Elena's hurried footsteps taking Lily's hand and the sound of the little girl's feet retreating down the hall. Each step was like a hammer blow to his hope. The door closed, leaving him in his newly imposed darkness, completely and terrifyingly alone. The darkness was total, cloying. Unlike the strategic darkness he had controlled, this was a cell without bars, a thick fog that smothered not just light, but hope. The silence in the office was now a physical presence, a vacuum where Lily's whispers and the click of her wooden blocks had once been. Each minute that dragged by felt like an hour. Arthur felt adrift on an ocean of nothingness. His only anchor, the cold fury that burned in his chest. Veronica entered the office mid-morning, her perfume enveloping him like a web. "You seem much more relaxed now, darling," she said, her voice as smooth as poisoned silk. "Without all that commotion. It's for the best, don't you think? To preserve your energy." He didn't answer, merely gave a slight nod. Every word from her was a reminder of his powerlessness. She had isolated him, cut off his connection to his small allies, and now she was reveling in her apparent victory. What good was all his capital, all his assets and holdings, if he couldn't even see the face of his jailer? He was a billionaire begging for a ray of light. Despair threatened to swallow him. For a moment, the thought of giving up, of simply surrendering to the darkness and waiting for the inevitable, seemed tempting. But then a memory struck him. A flashback to his early days in business, when he was just an ambitious young man with a dream and almost no money. He remembered a night when a major investment went sour, nearly bankrupting him. He had sat in his small, rented office, surrounded by bills and collection notices, feeling the same kind of despair. But he hadn't quit that night. He had poured himself a coffee, opened the ledgers again, and worked until sunrise, finding a solution, a loophole, a way to turn it around. The iron-willed determination that had made him a multi-billionaire was still there, buried under layers of pain and betrayal. He would not be defeated. If Veronica took his eyes, he would use his ears. If she took his ears, he would use his sense of touch. He needed to communicate with Elena. He needed to warn her, needed her help. But how? He couldn't shout, couldn't write. He needed a method that was silent, invisible to Veronica. The answer came from a trivial sensation. The slight itch on his wrist from his wool sweater. He ran his fingers over the sleeve and felt a small, loose thread at the seam of the cuff. It was thin, almost unnoticeable. But it was something. It was a start. In the kitchen, Lily sat on a stool, pushing peas around her plate. Her mother moved about the room, her movements tense and silent. Lily kept glancing toward the closed hallway door that led to the office. She had made a promise that Mr. needed her, and Mommy Veronica was stopping her from helping. A burning frustration, unusual for her age, bubbled inside her. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she had to do something. Arthur waited patiently. He knew Elena would bring him a glass of water in the afternoon, as was her routine. He spent the next hour carefully working at the loose thread, pulling it with his fingernail until he had a piece about 4 inches long. He wound it tightly around his index finger, hiding it in his palm. The sound of Elena's approaching footsteps was the signal. His heart hammered. This was his only chance. "Excuse me, Mr. Thorne," Elena's soft voice said. "Your water." He reached out, the gesture slow and deliberate, befitting a blind man. He felt the cool, moist glass touch his fingers. In the brief instant her hand met his to guide the glass, he acted. With a swift, subtle movement, he transferred the tiny ball of yarn from his palm to hers, closing her fingers over it for a fraction of a second. He felt her fingers pull away, and a chasm of uncertainty opened up. Had she noticed? Or had the little thread, his only desperate message, simply fallen to the floor, lost forever? Elena closed the kitchen door behind her, her heart beating uncontrollably against her ribs like a trapped bird. She leaned against the cool wood, her breath caught in her throat. Her hand, holding the empty tray, was trembling. Slowly, she opened her other palm. There, nestled in the center, was a small, insignificant piece of navy blue wool yarn. To anyone else, it would have been lint, a stray thread, but to Elena, it was a live grenade. It was from his sweater. She had noticed the rich color that morning. His gesture, the way his fingers had pressed into hers for a split second, had not been accidental. This was a message, a silent, desperate cry for help, passed from one hand to another in the darkness. What did it mean? That he knew, that he needed help. Fear chilled her blood. She was a housekeeper, a single mother struggling to keep a roof over her daughter's head. Getting involved in the secrets of a multi-billionaire family was a risk she couldn't afford to take. Veronica was a powerful and, Elena sensed, ruthless woman. She could ruin their lives with a snap of her fingers. The smart thing to do was to throw the thread in the trash, forget this ever happened, and focus on her job, keep her head down, protect her daughter. "Mommy, are you crying?" Lily's small voice pulled her from her panicked spiral. Elena looked down to see her daughter looking up at her, her eyes full of a concern no 6-year-old should have to feel. She hadn't realized that tears were silently streaming down her face. In that moment, looking at Lily's innocent face, Elena knew she couldn't ignore Arthur's plea. Lily was the one who had given him the first chance to see. Lily was his light. How could she teach her daughter about courage and kindness if she herself turned her back on a man in danger? Protecting Lily wasn't just about keeping her physically safe, it was about being an example of integrity. The kitchen door swung open and Veronica entered, holding a leather folder. "Elena, a slight change of plans," she said briskly. "From now on, to ensure Mr. Thorne isn't disturbed in any way, I will be bringing him his meals and drinks myself. You can focus on keeping the rest of the house spotless." The sentence was delivered with a thin smile, but it was an execution order. Veronica was cutting the last line of contact. The fear returned, stronger, but it was now mixed with a new, stubborn determination. If Veronica closed a door, Eleanor would find a window. Her gaze fell on Lily's drawings, held by magnets to the refrigerator. Smiling suns, crooked houses, and colorful flowers. An idea, dangerous and brilliant, began to form. Later, while Veronica was locked in her own office on a long call about investment fund profitability, Elena knelt beside Lily. "Sweetheart, do you want to make a special drawing for Mr. Thorne?" "But Mommy, Veronica said I can't go in there." "I know, but sometimes we have to send secret messages to our friends, don't we?" Elena whispered. "Draw him a sun, a big, bright yellow sun. So he knows we're thinking of him." Lily took up her crayons with an air of great importance. Minutes later, a radiant sun filled the page. Eleanor folded the paper twice. "Now for the hard part. You're going to walk past the hallway. If Mommy Veronica isn't looking, I want you to drop this paper right near his office door, like it fell out of your pocket by accident. Can you do that?" Lily nodded, the small paper hidden in her hand. Arthur sat in his chair, the darkness weighing on him. His plan had failed. Elena must not have understood. He was alone. The hope that had briefly bloomed withered into bitter despair. Then he heard it, the nearly imperceptible sound of little feet trying to be silent in the hallway, followed by a soft rustle near the base of the door, and then silence. He waited, his heart in his throat. Was it his imagination? Slowly, he maneuvered the wheelchair closer to the door. He leaned over, his body protesting the strain. His hand fumbled on the cool rug, sweeping the floor for something, and then his fingers touched it. Not yarn, paper, thin and slightly waxy from the pressure of a crayon. A message. Communication had been established. He held the paper as if it were a priceless treasure, with no idea what was drawn on it, but knowing it meant everything. Hidden in his hand, the paper seemed to burn. Arthur maneuvered the wheelchair back to his desk, his heart a mix of triumph and terror. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the paper. He couldn't see the image, but he could feel it. His fingertips traced the grooves left by the wax crayon, feeling the edges of a circular shape and the straight lines radiating from it. A sun. He knew, with a certainty that transcended sight, that Lily had drawn him a son. The light she had given him, now transformed into a secret symbol of hope. He folded the paper carefully and hid it in the inside pocket of his jacket, a talisman against the darkness. That small act of defiance strengthened him. He was no longer alone in this fight. He had allies, however small and frightened they might be. But the calm was short-lived. The next day, Veronica's war escalated, shifting from a tactic of isolation to one of direct intimidation. Arthur was in his office, the door ajar as Veronica now insisted on leaving it. "So, I can hear you if you need anything." It was another form of control, a way to monitor every sound. He heard Elena and Lily passing in the hall. Lily was humming a nursery rhyme, a sound that for a brief moment brought life to the silent corridors. Then came a violent crash, the sharp, explosive sound of ceramic shattering on marble, followed by a terrified scream from Lily and a gasp from Elena. "Lily!" Elena cried, her voice filled with panic. Arthur gripped the arms of his chair, his entire body rigid. What had happened? "Oh my goodness!" Veronica's voice sounded falsely alarmed from the nearby living room. "Sweetie, are you all right? Elena, be more careful. I've told you, those antique pedestals are unstable." Arthur heard Veronica's hurried steps, followed by her soothing murmurs to a now softly weeping Lily. "It was just a scare, honey. The vase startled you, didn't it? A big, silly vase. See, not a scratch on you." The scene played out in his mind with horrifying clarity. A heavy vase, conveniently unstable, falling inches from a child. It wasn't an accident. It was a warning, a message for Elena, far more sinister than a drawing of a sun. It was Veronica saying, "I can get to her, back off." And in that instant, as he listened to Veronica's false solicitude, Arthur's mind was thrown back in time. A flashback hit him with the force of a wave. He saw himself months before the death of his first wife, Beatrice. He remembered how Beatrice, weakened by her mysterious illness, had become clumsy, dropping cups, tripping over rugs. And always, Veronica, then her young, dedicated private nurse, was there to steady her with that same concerned, soothing voice. "Careful, Mrs. Beatrice. Let me get that for you. You need to rest." He had seen it as dedication. Now, with the sound of the shattered vase echoing in his ears, he saw it as a pattern of induced frailty and control disguised as care. The suspicion, once a shadow, now became a concrete, monstrous form. Veronica wasn't just trying to steal his current fortune. She had already secured one inheritance. Arthur's blood ran cold. Beatrice's death hadn't been an unavoidable tragedy. It had been the first step in Veronica's plan. The realization left him breathless. The paper in his pocket, once a symbol of hope, now seemed terribly inadequate. Drawings and threads of yarn weren't weapons. They were whispers in a hurricane. He was fighting a monster who had no qualms about hurting a child to achieve her goals. He needed more. He needed proof. Something he could get to the outside world. Something that could destroy Veronica's facade once and for all. But how? How could a blind man, confined to a wheelchair, gather evidence against the woman who controlled every second of his life? The revelation about Beatrice's death changed the chessboard. Arthur was no longer playing to get his money or his freedom back. He was playing for justice, for Beatrice, and to protect the lives of Lily and Elena. Fear gave way to an icy fury, a determination so sharp it cut through the fog of his despair. He knew Veronica would stop at nothing. The accident with the vase was just the beginning. He needed irrefutable proof, and he needed it fast. Arthur's brain, a machine for business strategy that had turned a small stake into a billion-dollar empire, began working with frantic speed. He didn't have eyes, but he had his memory. He knew every inch of this house, every object, every sound, and he knew that somewhere Veronica would make a mistake. She underestimated him. She believed he was just an empty shell, a broken man. That was his greatest advantage. The idea came from a distant memory, a paranoia from his early days as a young multimillionaire, worried about corporate espionage. In his old briefcase, stored in the back of a closet in his office, was a gift from a security expert. A pen. Not an ordinary pen. It was a high-tech audio recording device disguised as an elegant writing instrument. Was it possible it was still there? And more importantly, would it still work after all this time? Now, the challenge was how to get it. He couldn't just ask Veronica to open the closet. He needed his allies. The next day, he put his plan into motion. When Veronica came in to open the drapes, he feigned a chill. "Veronica, could you get me that old cashmere shawl? I think it's on the top shelf of the office closet." It was a lure. She opened the closet door, grumbling about him being cold on a warm day. "I don't see any shawl here, Arthur. Just old boxes and briefcases." "Are you sure? In the back, behind that black leather briefcase?" He pressed, guiding her with his memory. He heard the rustle of papers, the sound of objects being moved. It was now or never. "Elena," he called out, his voice a little louder than usual. "Could you bring me some tea, please? Very hot." It was the prearranged signal. Minutes later, Elena entered with the tray. While Veronica was distracted, her back turned. Rummaging on the top shelf of the closet, Elena placed the cup on the desk and, in a move that lasted less than a second, picked up the pen Arthur had managed to push to the edge of the desk the night before and replaced it with an ordinary one. The plan worked. Veronica turned around, frustrated. "There's no shawl here. You must be mistaken." And she left, not noticing the switch. Now the pen, his only weapon, was with Eleanor. The next step was even more dangerous. That evening, Arthur pretended to be restless, agitated. "I can't sleep," he complained. "I think some fresh air would do me good." Veronica, reluctant but wanting to maintain her facade as a devoted wife, wheeled him out to the veranda adjoining the office. While she went to fetch a blanket, Arthur fumbled under the small wrought-iron table and found what he was hoping for, a small package, secured with tape by Elena earlier in the day. It was the pen. The most tense moment of his life was about to begin. "Veronica," he said when she returned, his voice carefully calibrated to sound weary and resigned. "You were right. The market is unstable. I trust your judgment. Tomorrow, please call our lawyers and finalize the complete transfer of all my assets and controlling shares to your name. I'm tired of fighting." He activated the recording, with a nearly inaudible click. The silence that followed was the longest of his life. He felt her gaze on him, examining, probing. He had expected elation, a cry of victory, but what came next chilled his soul. Veronica let out a low laugh, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Oh, my poor, naive Arthur," she said, her voice a sweet poison. "Do you really think I need lawyers for that? The power of attorney you signed when you were still dazed in the hospital gives me total control. But your surrender, that makes it all the more poetic." She leaned in, her perfume enveloping him. "And since we're being honest," she whispered, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, "you won't have to worry about finances for much longer. The process we're accelerating. Let's just say it will ensure your eternal rest, just like it ensured Beatrice's. That fool never suspected her daily medicine was what was slowly killing her. Every word was a stab, a confirmation of his worst nightmares." He forced himself to remain still, his face a mask of defeat, while the pen's tiny red light blinked silently in the darkness under the table, recording everything. Veronica's confession hung in the cold night air, a toxic cloud of pure evil. Arthur felt as if the floor had disappeared from under his chair. Every one of her words, every poisoned syllable, was now safely stored on the tiny digital device hidden inches from where she stood. He maintained the expression of a defeated man, allowing a slight tremor to run through his hands, an acting detail he hoped she would interpret as fear and resignation. "Rest," he repeated, his voice a hoarse whisper. "So, that's why she got so weak." "She was weak to begin with," Veronica scoffed, moving away from him to the veranda's balustrade, silhouetted against the moon. "She didn't deserve you. She didn't deserve this life, this wealth. I did. I earned it. I built this new life for us." The grandiosity of her delusion was breathtaking. In her mind, she wasn't a criminal, but a heroine claiming what was rightfully hers. That was the last piece he needed. He deactivated the recording with a subtle click. The weapon was loaded. Now, he just had to fire it. The next day was a masterpiece of coordinated deception. In the morning, Elena, under the pretext of cleaning the patio, found the pen under the veranda table. "Mrs. Thorne, look, Mr. Thorne must have dropped his pen last night." Veronica took it, thought nothing of it, and placed it back on the office desk. Hours later, while Veronica was on a conference call, Elena asked for permission to take Lily to a routine doctor's appointment. It was the perfect alibi. Instead of the doctor's office, Elena drove straight to the office of Dr. Ramirez, Arthur's family doctor for over 30 years and one of his most loyal friends. Simultaneously, Arthur's trusted lawyer alerted the previous night by a pre-programmed email sent from an old hidden tablet, arrived at the police department with copies of financial documents showing the massive fraudulent transfers Veronica had been making. The final piece of the puzzle was a courier who delivered a sealed envelope to the most reputable ophthalmology lab in the city, containing a sample of the protective eye drops, which Arthur had managed to collect in a tiny hidden vial. The gears of justice, slow but relentless, began to turn. The first domino to fall was the doctor. Dr. Ramirez listened to the recording with an expression that shifted from disbelief to absolute horror. Veronica's calm, cruel voice confessing what she'd done to Beatrice and what she planned for Arthur was undeniable. He immediately contacted the authorities. The second victory came from the lab. The analysis of the eye drops revealed a complex chemical compound, a liquid polymer that formed a translucent cellulose film upon contact with air and the eye's heat, designed to slowly dissolve over 24 hours. It was a bespoke substance, not a medication. It was, as Lily had said, gunk. Veronica's arrest was anticlimactic in its ordinariness. She was in the middle of signing a document that would transfer the last of Arthur's significant funds to an offshore account when two detectives walked into her office. She looked at them with arrogance, ready to dismiss them. But when they played the recording, her face crumbled. The mask of control shattered, revealing the terrified, pathetic woman beneath. Arthur watched it all from his doorway, no longer pretending. For the first time in months, he looked at her with clear, steady eyes. The shock on her face when she saw that he could see was almost as satisfying as the sound of handcuffs clicking around her wrists. That afternoon, the silence in the mansion was different. It wasn't oppressive, but peaceful. Arthur's first victory, the official recovery of his sight, was bittersweet. The sunlight streaming through the window was beautiful, but it also illuminated the ugly truth of the years that had been stolen from him. The second victory, the recovery of his empire, would be a long, bureaucratic process in the courts, but the groundwork to nullify every fraudulent transaction was now firmly laid. But the most important victory was yet to come. He was sitting in his office when he heard hesitant footsteps in the hall. Elena and Lily stood in the doorway, unsure of their place in this new world. Arthur looked at them, the brave woman and the little girl who had given him back his life, and a genuine smile, the first in a long time, lit up his face. "Come in," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think we have a lot to talk about regarding the future." 5 weeks had passed since that fateful morning, 5 weeks that felt like a lifetime. The mansion, once a silent mausoleum of deceit, was now breathing. The windows were thrown open, letting the summer breeze carry the sound of laughter down the hall. The scent of lemon polish had been replaced by the aroma of chocolate cake baking in the oven, a special recipe of Elena's. In the office, the imposing mahogany desk was no longer covered in suspicious financial documents, but with colorful drawings and a half-finished jigsaw puzzle. Arthur was no longer in his wheelchair. Leaning on a handsome wooden cane, he took a few careful steps across the Persian rug. The intensive physical therapy started as soon as he was free of the regimen of light sedatives Veronica had been mixing into his food, was yielding miraculous results. The paralysis had not been permanent, merely a severe muscle weakness caused by atrophy and medication. His steps were slow, hesitant, but they were his own. Each one was a declaration of victory. Lily ran to him, holding up a picture book. "Read it to me again, Daddy," she asked. The word Daddy sounding the most natural thing in the world. Arthur scooped her up with one strong arm and sat down in his large leather armchair. The adoption had been a swift process, facilitated by his influence and the clear, loving bond between them. He wasn't just adopting Lily, he was formalizing the family that had already formed in their hearts. Elena came in, wiping her hands on an apron, a smile lighting up her face. She was no longer the frightened housekeeper, but the matriarch of this home, a partner in every sense of the word. She and Arthur had found a safe harbor in each other, a mutual understanding born from adversity and respect. Justice for Veronica had been swift and decisive. Faced with the recording, the lab analysis of the eye drops, and the overwhelming evidence from Beatrice's exhumation, she confessed to everything in exchange for a lesser sentence. The story shocked the business world. The billionaire held blind and captive by his manipulative wife. But for Arthur, the story wasn't about revenge. It was about rebirth. He regained control of his businesses, methodically undoing the damage Veronica had wrought. But his perspective had changed. He no longer saw just numbers, stocks, and profits. He saw people, families, futures. He established a foundation in Beatrice's name, dedicated to helping victims of domestic abuse and psychological manipulation, ensuring his first wife's suffering was not in vain. The fortune that had nearly destroyed him had now become a tool for healing. That afternoon, Arthur, Elena, and Lily were in the garden, the same garden where he had overheard terrifying conversations. Now, it was a place of peace. Lily chased butterflies, her shrieks of joy echoing among the rose bushes. Arthur watched, standing without his cane, leaning lightly against Elena. "Do you ever think about it?" he said, his voice low. "If your neighbor hadn't had that emergency, if you hadn't brought Lily here that day." Elena squeezed his hand. "I think about it every day. And I realize that life has a funny way of putting us exactly where we need to be, even if we don't understand it at the time." He looked at her face, at the strength and kindness in her eyes, and then at Lily, a small hurricane of life and happiness. The tycoon, who lived in artificial darkness, discovered he had to pretend to be blind to finally see the truth of what really mattered. The little girl who just wanted to clean some gunk from a man's eyes became the light that exposed years of dark manipulation. And the mansion that had witnessed years of deceit was transformed into the home where a true family learned that the greatest wealth isn't held in banks or invested in stocks, but in the bonds of love and trust that heal us and make us whole.